In 2003, there was a guy named Mike who saved $70,000 for a down payment on a house in Phoenix. 15% down on a $470,000 property. He spent 8 months looking, made 4 offers, lost 3 bidding wars, finally closed on a place that needed work. 3 years later, that house was worth $320,000. Mike lost his down payment, ruined his credit, and spent the next decade rebuilding. But here's the thing. His buddy James took that same $70,000 and bought shares in a real estate investment trust that owned 1,700 apartment buildings across the Sun Belt. James didn't fix a single toilet, didn't negotiate with a single contractor. And by 2025, that $70,000 had turned into $412,000 in stock value. Plus, he'd collected about $98,000 in dividends along the way. Same money, same time frame. One guy owned a house, the other guy owned a piece of 1,700 houses. Why does everyone want to be Mike? Here's what I'm going to show you. The math behind why buying a single-family home is often the worst possible use of a large pile of cash if your actual goal is building wealth. Not living somewhere nice, not having a yard for your kids, wealth. And I'm going to explain the psychological trap that makes smart people confuse those two things, because understanding that trap is worth more than any investment advice I could give you. By the way, I built a free early retirement calculator because most online ones are mathematically wrong. It uses BlackRock and Vanguard logic to expose the weak points in your plan, and I only ask for your email to send the report, so I don't store any of your financial data. Link in the description. Think of your money like water. You've got a fixed amount of it at any given time. When you pour it into a house, that water disappears into the ground. It's locked there. Can't use it for anything else. Can't pivot. Can't compound efficiently. You're hoping that 30 years from now, when you finally own the place free and clear, the ground will have magically generated more water than you poured in. That's the bet. But here's what nobody tells you about that bet. You're not just betting on real estate prices going up. You're betting on them going up faster than stocks after you account for all the hidden costs, while simultaneously giving up every other opportunity that money could have seized in 3 decades. This is the central metaphor I want you to hold on to: water. Where you pour it determines what grows, and real estate is very thirsty dirt. Let's start with a story. Back in 2008, right before the crash, my buddy's dad sat me down. He was a successful dentist. Owned his practice building, owned his house, owned a rental property, all paid off. He told me, "Bobby, real estate is the only real wealth." He had this conviction in his voice. 6 months later, his practice building dropped 40% in value. His house dropped 38%. His rental property? Tenants stopped paying, took 9 months to evict, place needed $22,000 in repairs. He survived because his dental practice made money, not because his real estate did. But he never connected those dots. Know what he told me in 2010? Real estate is the only real wealth. Just gotta weather the storms. The psychology here is fascinating. He'd mentally separated the asset from reality. The building wasn't worth what someone would pay for it. It was worth what he needed to believe it was worth, so his worldview didn't collapse. Now you might think, okay, but that was a unique crisis. Real estate always bounces back. And you'd be half right. It does usually recover, but here's what you're missing. Opportunity cost. Every dollar in that house is a dollar not somewhere else. Let me show you what I mean with real numbers, because this is where it gets interesting. You've got $500,000, you're 40 years old, you're trying to decide between 2 paths. Path 1, you buy a house, $500,000 purchase price in a decent suburb. You put down 20%, that's $100,000. You finance $400,000 at 7% for 30 years. That's a monthly payment of $2,660 just for principal and interest. Add property tax at 1.25% annually, that's $521 a month. Homeowner's insurance, $175 a month. Maintenance, which every honest contractor will tell you runs 1% of home value annually, that's another $417 a month. Your total monthly hit is $3,773. Over 30 years, you'll pay $558,000 in interest to the bank, $225,000 in property taxes, $63,000 in insurance, $150,000 in maintenance. That's $996,000 in total costs, plus your $100,000 down payment. $1.096 million to own a house that you bought for $500,000. But wait, you're saying, the house appreciates. National average is about 3.5% annually. Okay, let's be generous and say your house follows that trend. After 30 years, that $500,000 house is worth $1.4 million. You subtract the $1.096 million in total costs, your net gain is $304,000. Except you also need to subtract the $72,000 you spent on closing costs and the $84,000 you'll spend selling it with a 6% realtor commission. Your actual net gain is $148,000 over 30 years. That's a compound annual return of about 1.6%. You'd have done better with treasury bills. Path 2, you take that same $500,000, you invest it in a diversified portfolio, 70% in an S&P 500 index fund, 20% in real estate investment trusts, 10% in dividend aristocrats. The S&P has averaged about 10% annually since 1928, even accounting for crashes. REITs have averaged about 9.5%. Dividend aristocrats, about 8.5%. Your blended rate is around 9.6%. After 30 years, assuming you don't add a single additional dollar, that $500,000 becomes $8.7 million. Not $1.4 million in home value minus costs, $8.7 million in liquid assets that you can access anytime. This is the water metaphor again. You poured $500,000 of water into the ground hoping for a house-shaped tree. You got a return of 1.6% annually. Your neighbor poured the same water into stocks and REITs. He got 9.6%. His water made more water. Your water made slightly more dirt. Now here's where someone always jumps in. But Bobby, I need somewhere to live. If I don't buy, I'm paying rent. That's throwing money away. This is the $1 trillion lie. Let's run those numbers. Same scenario. You've got $500,000 to invest. But instead of buying, you rent a comparable place for $3,000 a month. Yes, that's less than the $3,773 you'd spend monthly on ownership. But let's say you're irresponsible and you rent a nicer place for $4,000 a month just because you can. Over 30 years, you'll pay $1.44 million in rent. Sounds terrible, right? But remember, you still have that $500,000 invested. It grows to $8.7 million. Subtract your $1.44 million in rent, you're still sitting on $7.26 million. Compare that to the homeowner who has $1.4 million in home equity, except it's not liquid, and if he wants to access it, he needs to sell the house and pay closing costs, or open a home equity line of credit and pay 7% interest on his own money. The renter has $7.26 million in actual money. The homeowner has a paid-off house and no liquidity. But you might be thinking, what if real estate does better than 3.5%? What if my area sees 6% annual appreciation? Okay, let's run those numbers. Your $500,000 house grows at 6% for 30 years. It's now worth $2.87 million. Subtract all the costs we calculated, about $1.1 million. Subtract selling costs, you net about $1.6 million. That's better. That's a 4.9% annual return. Still worse than the stock market's historical average of 10%, and you're comparing the absolute best case for real estate against the average case for stocks. What if stocks do their best case? What if you catch the 30-year run from 1990 to 2020, where the S&P averaged 11.8%? Your $500,000 becomes $13.7 million. The homeowner's best case doesn't even compete with the stock investor's average case. There's a parable I love. It's about two brothers in Taiwan in the 1960s. One brother saved money for 15 years and bought a factory building. He was so proud. Owned real estate. Tangible. Real. The other brother took his savings and bought shares in 10 different factories, none of which he'd ever seen. The first brother spent his days maintaining his building, dealing with tenants, arguing with the city about permits. The second brother did nothing, just collected dividends and reinvested them. 40 years later, the first brother's building was worth 8 times what he paid. Sounds incredible. The second brother's shares were worth 63 times what he paid, and he'd collected enough dividends over the decades to buy 4 buildings just like his brothers if he wanted to. The first brother owned a factory. The second brother owned a piece of the entire economy. Same starting capital, different level of thinking. Here's the psychological trap. And this is what makes it so insidious. Home ownership triggers something primal in our brains. It feels like security. Your grandfather bought a house for $40,000 in 1968 and sold it for $700,000 in 2005. He tells you that story every Thanksgiving. He made $660,000. Except he never mentions the $180,000 he spent on improvements, or the $150,000 in interest he paid, or the $90,000 in property taxes, or the fact that if he'd invested that $40,000 in the S&P 500 in 1968, it would have been worth $3.2 million by 2005. But he can't see that. Because you can't park your car in a stock portfolio. You can't show your neighbors your beautiful dividend statements. The house is visible. It's social proof. It's a story you can tell yourself about being a grown-up. There's another layer here that nobody talks about. The bank loves when you buy a house. Know why? Because you're giving them guaranteed income for 30 years. That 7% mortgage rate you're paying, the bank just sold your loan to a pension fund for 96 cents on the dollar, booked the 4% gain immediately, and moved on. The pension fund is thrilled because they just bought a guaranteed 7% return backed by your labor for 3 decades. You think you're building equity. The system sees you as a cash-producing asset. You're not the investor. You're the investment. Every month, you wake up and go to work, and a portion of your labor gets automatically converted into bond payments for a pension fund in Minnesota. You're a human annuity. Let me show you how this plays out with someone specific, because abstract numbers don't stick. Meet Tom. He's 38. He's a software engineer in Austin. Makes $190,000 a year. He saved $125,000 for a house down payment. He's been looking for 14 months. Every house he likes goes for $50,000 over asking. He's exhausted. His wife is exhausted. Their parents keep asking when they're going to settle down. Here's what Tom doesn't realize. He's trying to win a rigged game. The houses he's bidding on? 42% of single-family home purchases in markets like Austin are now investors and institutions, not families. Investors. They're paying cash, waiving inspections, closing in 9 days. Tom can't compete. He's got a government-backed mortgage that requires an appraisal and inspection. He's slow money. They're fast money. And even if Tom wins a bidding war, he's overpaying. He'll be underwater the moment mortgage rates shift or the local economy stumbles. What should Tom do instead? Here's the math. He takes that $125,000 and splits it 3 ways. $40,000 into VTI, that's Vanguard's total stock market fund. $40,000 into VNQ, that's Vanguard's real estate investment trust fund. $45,000 into SCHD, that's Schwab's dividend equity fund. His blended yield is about 3.2% annually in dividends alone. That's $4,000 a year, $333 a month. That covers part of his rent. But the real magic is growth. At historical averages, that $125,000 becomes $1 million in 22 years. Tom is 38. By 60, he's a millionaire from that one decision. Meanwhile, his coworker bought the house. At 60, his coworker owns a paid-off house worth maybe $800,000 in a suburb that's declining because everyone's remote now and nobody wants to live in Austin anymore. Tom has liquid assets. His coworker has a house he needs to sell in a bad market if he wants to retire somewhere cheaper. Now you're probably asking yourself, what about the tax benefits? Everyone says you can deduct mortgage interest. Here's the thing about that argument. It's outdated. The 2017 tax law changed everything. The standard deduction is now $29,200 for a married couple filing jointly in 2026. For you to benefit from itemizing, your mortgage interest plus state and local taxes plus charitable donations need to exceed that. With a $400,000 loan at 7%, your first year interest is about $27,000. Add $10,000 in state and local taxes, that's the cap. You're at $37,000, you beat the standard deduction by $7,800. That saves you maybe $2,000 in taxes if you're in the 24% bracket. $2,000 a year. You're spending $3,773 a month to save $2,000 a year. That's not a tax benefit. That's a tax participation trophy. Meanwhile, your stocks are growing tax deferred until you sell. And if you hold them more than a year, you pay long-term capital gains, which tops out at 20% for most people. Way better than your ordinary income rate. Plus, here's a trick the wealthy use. You never actually sell. You die holding those stocks. Your kids inherit them with a stepped up basis. All those gains, tax-free. The IRS literally forgives all the appreciation. You can't do that with a house. When you die, your kids inherit the house at fair market value, sure, but they also inherit the property taxes, the maintenance, the emotional fight about who gets it. With stocks, they just sell and split the cash. Clean, simple, no arguments about who has to pay for the new roof. There's a deeper pattern here if you zoom out. Every major financial institution is long real estate and wants you to be too. Banks make money on mortgages, local governments make money on property taxes. Realtors make 6% on every transaction. The 30-year mortgage is the greatest financial product ever invented. Not for you, but for them. It turns your future labor into a tradable bond. You're not buying freedom. You're buying a 30-year obligation that transfers your productivity to note holders. I spent 20 plus years running a business, surrounded by accountants and fiscal lawyers. They all own stocks. Most of them rent. The people who understand how money actually moves don't own houses. They own cash flowing assets. Here's the comedic part. I was at a dinner party last year. Guy across from me, mid-40s, VP at some tech company. He starts bragging about his house. Just refinanced at 6.5%. Pulled out $80,000 in equity. Used it to remodel the kitchen. I asked him what the house was worth. About $900,000. He said, I asked what he paid. $650 back in 2019. I did the math in my head. His net gain was $250,000 in equity over 6 years, but he just pulled out $80,000 and spent it on granite countertops. I asked if he'd considered that $80,000 in the S&P since 2019 would be worth about $140,000 today. He looked at me like I'd suggested he eat his dog. But I needed a new kitchen, he said. No, man, you needed to feel like your house was growing your wealth. The kitchen was just the excuse. Or this. A client of mine, 52 years old, owns a house free and clear in suburban Chicago. It's worth about $700,000. He complains constantly about being cash poor. Can't afford to travel, can't afford to retire early. I told him, sell the house. Buy a $700,000 dividend portfolio yielding 4%. That's $28,000 a year in passive income. Rent a condo for $2,000 a month. You'll still have $4,000 a year left over, plus your portfolio will grow. He said, and I quote, but where would I live? I just told you. A condo. No, I mean, where would I really live? This is the mental trap. The house isn't an asset to him. It's his identity. Selling it would mean admitting he's been pouring water into thirsty dirt for 30 years. Let's get even more specific with a scenario you can model yourself. You're 45 years old. You have $300,000 in savings. You're deciding between buying a $500,000 house with 60% down to keep the mortgage small, or investing the full $300,000 and renting indefinitely. Option A, the house. You put $300,000 down, finance $200,000 at 7% for 15 years because you want it paid off fast. Monthly payment is $1,797. Add property tax, insurance, maintenance, you're at $2,800 a month. Over 15 years, you pay $123,000 in interest, $113,000 in property taxes, $32,000 in insurance, $75,000 in maintenance. Total cost is $643,000. Your house appreciates at 3.5% annually. After 15 years, it's worth $823,000. Your net gain is $180,000 after costs. You're 60 years old. You own a house free and clear. No liquidity. Option B, invest and rent. You invest $300,000 in a 60-40 stock bond portfolio yielding about 8% annually after inflation. You rent for $2,500 a month. Over 15 years, you pay $450,000 in rent, but your portfolio grows to $950,000. Subtract the rent, you have $500,000 in liquid assets at age 60. You have more than twice the wealth of the homeowner, and you can access it immediately without selling anything. Plus, you can keep renting or buy a house in cash if you want. You have options. The homeowner has a house. This is where most people's brains short circuit. They can see the math, they can't emotionally accept it. Because we've been conditioned by 80 years of post-World War II propaganda that home ownership equals success, The government pushed it, the banks pushed it, your parents pushed it, and for a specific generation, the boomers, it worked. They bought houses for 3 times their annual income when mortgage rates were 9%, but inflation was running at 6%, meaning their real borrowing cost was 3%, and they locked in fixed payments while their salaries doubled every decade. The math worked for them. It doesn't work for you. You're buying houses for 8 times your annual income when inflation is 3% and mortgage rates are 7%. Your real borrowing cost is 4% and your salary growth is 2% annually if you're lucky. You're running the same play in a different game. It's not going to work. Here's what I think is actually happening. Real estate is a religion, and religions don't care about math. They care about belonging. When you buy a house, you join the homeowner class. You get to complain about property taxes with your neighbors. You get to post pictures of your backyard on social media. You get to tell your parents you finally made it. That emotional payoff is real. I'm not dismissing it, but if your goal is financial independence, if your goal is retiring early, if your goal is building generational wealth, the house is a trap. It's a lifestyle purchase masquerading as an investment. Let me give you 3 specific moves you can make right now. First, if you don't own a house yet, don't buy one. Take whatever you've saved for a down payment and split it between low-cost index funds and real estate investment trusts. You get the real estate exposure without the concentration risk or the maintenance. You stay liquid, you stay flexible. Second, if you already own a house and you're still paying a mortgage, run the numbers on selling. I know that sounds insane. But if your house has appreciated significantly and you're sitting on, say, $400,000 in equity, you could sell, rent for half your current housing cost, invest the equity, and be financially independent in 15 years instead of 30. The math might shock you. Third, stop thinking of your primary residence as an asset. It's a liability that you live in. An asset puts money in your pocket. A liability takes money out. Your house takes money out every single month. If you want real estate as an investment, buy REITs. They pay dividends. Your house pays property taxes. I'll leave you with this. I'm retired now with a few $1,000,000 in the stock market. I rent. People think that's weird. They ask me, why don't you just buy a place? You can afford it. And I tell them, because I'd rather own 10,000 apartments through my Vanguard real estate fund than own one house that I have to maintain. Don't work for money. Own the companies that do. The house can't work for you. It just sits there, eating cash, appreciating slower than inflation after costs, trapping your capital for decades. The companies you own through stocks, they're working 24 hours a day, generating profit, paying you dividends, compounding your wealth while you sleep. Water finds its level. Pour it where it multiplies.